Hey there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Bible in Life podcast. My name is John Whitaker. I am the host and creator of the Bible in Life, as well as the listener's commentary on the New Testament, where I just teach straight through the books of the Bible in kind of clear, down-to-earth fashion. And on this episode of the Bible in Life, we're going to have a really special kind of conversation between myself and my friend Nick Cady. Nick is a pastor serving in Colorado at the present time at Whitefields Community Church. He's the host of the Theology for the People podcast, and we kind of collaborated together on this episode after spending some time together at a training weekend and talking in the airport on our way to our respective homes. And we really wanted to focus on the idea of what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? How do you create a discipleship pathway in the church? To think through what are some of the biblical themes and aims when it comes to spiritual growth? What does it mean to grow spiritually, and as far as like a biblical theology of that? And so we collaborated and connected on this, and so he shared this conversation on his Theology for the People podcast. I'm sharing it here. And I hope you'll check out Nick's work. He has been a pastor and a missionary and just has a real genuine down-to-earth perspective on life and ministry and people. So I encourage you to check out the Theology for the People podcast as well. And I hope you enjoy this conversation revolving around discipleship and spiritual growth.
Well, hey, John, good to talk to you.
Yeah. Hey, Nick. Good to see you again and talk with you as well.
So, John, you and I were sitting in the Oakland airport.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we were sitting in the Oakland airport, hanging out, and we said, you know what we should do? We should do a podcast episode together.
And then it was like, well, what will we talk about? So here we are.
I talked about theological method, and you said, let's talk about spiritual growth instead.
Yeah, that's true. And not because I don't like theological method. I just wasn't so sure that I had a lot to contribute to that conversation. So,
well, when you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And when you study theological method, that's the solution or the issue for everything. So I'm sure it'll come up in whatever we talk about.
Yeah, probably so.
So, John, for the sake of my audience, could you introduce yourself? I've shared your resource with a lot of people, and so I'm excited for you to be on.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah. So my name is John Whitaker. I have been a pastor and Bible college professor for a long time, still serve as an adjunct professor here where I live in Boise, Idaho. But the main thing I'm doing right now is creating a whole bunch of online kind of Bible teaching resources. The main one of that is this thing called the listener's commentary, which if you're familiar with what a Bible commentary is, right, it just guides you through a Bible book, gives you a little bit of the backstory, and then guides you paragraph by paragraph through what this Bible book is saying to understand. Well, I'm creating one of those in audio fashion for the average ordinary Christian who just says, man, I need some help understanding this thing called the Bible. Would you guide me through it? So I like to describe it as kind of blue jeans theology for everyday life, theology for ordinary people. So rooted in serious scholarship, because I taught the Bible, still teach the Bible at the college level to undergraduates, but aimed in a way to help just someone who really wants to understand the Bible grasp it. So listener's commentary, that's kind of the heart of what I'm doing, but it got a bunch of other irons in the fire as well. So that's kind of me. So what about you?
Yeah.
My audience doesn't know who you are.
That's
so
right.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Nick?
Yeah. So I pastor a church in Longmont, Colorado, which is just right outside of Boulder. I always say we're the Khloe Kardashian to Boulder's Kim Kardashian. I would say it was a very similar city and, really has all the same culture and all of that as Boulder. We're just less known. But I think in many ways, that's what makes, Longmont so charming. And so, we're right on the foothills of the Rockies. I grew up in Denver. And when I was 18 years old, I moved to Hungary as a missionary. I planned to stay for 8 months. I ended up staying for 10 years. Got married there, had a couple kids there, planted 2 churches with Calvary Chapel. While I was planting the first of those churches, I was working with missionaries from another organization, from Wycliffe Bible Translators, and they got me connected to a school in England and I started doing my theological studies there at the University of Gloucestershire, right outside the great city of Gloucester in the west of England. And I intended to just take a few classes to improve my knowledge of the Gospel of Luke. But turns out that I really enjoyed it and got so much out of it. So I did my undergrad there in Gloucester, and then I did my master's degree in integrative theology, which is about theological method. I did that at London School of Theology, and I have been kicking around the idea of continuing my education, and I probably will at some point. So
yeah, that's good. That's good. All right. So,
well, on the listener's commentary, John, you just came out with a great app for iPhone.
Yes.
And I used it this morning. I had a long drive, listened to you. And so I tell anybody, check it out. It's really cool because a lot of times, pastors will listen to other pastors preach a sermon via audio about that. I just think, they're preaching to a different audience. They are doing a different thing. And led by God in different ways. If you're looking for a preparation resource, I think that having a listener's commentary is very helpful because it's not intended to be a sermon. It's a commentary, and you can listen to it while you drive or ride a bike or whatever you do.
Yeah, that's kind of my heart behind it. So I'm glad you're finding it useful. Hopefully other people as well. The app is only for iPhone right now. The Android developer is getting close. So hopefully we'll have one for Android as well pretty soon.
Awesome. Yeah. And so why were we in Oakland? It's because you and I served together on the leadership team of Expositors Collective, and you should all check that out as well.
Yeah. Yep. So very good. We were there flying home after a training event. So.
Yeah. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is spiritual growth. You had said that this is a passion of yours. I had heard you say that on another occasion as well, that I think it was a previous Expositors Collective we had been at. You talked about how every church needs a discipleship pathway. And I had kind of always had a discipleship pathway in mind. In fact, I had even talked about our discipleship pathway when I spoke at conferences and things like that on leadership. But after that conversation that we had the previous time, I went home. During our church staff meeting, I wrote it all out on a big whiteboard that we have in the conference room. And then my executive pastor took it and made it into like an infographic. And I thought, cool, now we have a discipleship pathway. But I want to run that pathway by you because I want to see if we did good or not. And if we didn't, then I don't know what I'm going to do, John. I don't know, because we've invested so much in this already.
Yeah. Maybe some fine tuning. We'll see. We'll see when we get there.
Okay. But anyway, I want to talk to you about the topics of spiritual growth. So first of all, let's start with a biblical theology of spiritual growth.
Yeah. And obviously we could spend a long time talking about that topic itself and developing that whole thing. I think one of the key things is just that we actually have a well-grounded, well-thought-through biblical theology of spiritual growth as pastors and as churches. And unfortunately, most churches don't. You ask the average pastor, so how does a person change? How does a new believer actually become like Jesus? And a lot of times you get kind of blank stares, and which means they haven't thought about it and they don't have it right there. So at the heart of a biblical theology of spiritual growth is that. I mean, that's the goal. That's the target, becoming like Jesus. That a disciple is not above his teacher, but when he's fully formed shall be like his teacher. That's Jesus' assumption about what it means to be a disciple. And that's what he was forming. That's what we're called to make as disciples. And so his just bare bones assumption is a disciple, when he's fully formed, will be like his teacher. In our case, that means like Jesus. And so that at least sets the target and the goal for it, right? Is becoming like Jesus. And so what's involved in that? How does that happen? And some of those sorts of things. And, you've got things related to sin and salvation and justification and new life that all have to be thought through and kind of in some fashion integrated into a biblical theology of spiritual growth. So I always default towards things like the Sermon on the Mount as a person who is growing spiritually is somebody who is becoming like that person described in Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. So that gives, more than the big broad category, become like Jesus, which could be so big that we don't fully, it says nothing because what does that mean? Well, it means that you're becoming the kind of person who doesn't just not murder. You're replacing anger with peace and patience. You're becoming the kind of person who doesn't just not have an affair. You're also becoming the kind of person where your sexual desire is now arranged so much under the leadership of Jesus that you don't even look at another person to lust for them. You're becoming the kind of person who you're so whole that when you give your word, you will keep your word. You don't have to cross your heart and hope to die, right, or anything like that. You'll actually keep your word. You're becoming that kind of person that Jesus describes in the Sermon on the Mount. So, that at least begins to set some kind of competencies or criteria or objectives, if you will, for our spiritual growth or spiritual formation plan or program in the church. So as far as at least outcomes and what we're after, targets that we're after, that I think that begins to help us at least get some sort of target in mind rather than, well, we're growing spiritually. And a lot of times we don't even know exactly what that means, So those are at least some of the targets. Then there's obviously the strategies and methods behind it. And we can talk more about that even biblically as well. But at least that gives us, target we're aiming at.
Yeah. So usually when I think of like biblical theology, I mean, obviously you could talk about theology, which comes from the Bible, which would be almost more of like the term we might use for that is more like a systematic theology. But I think when I think about biblical theology, I'm thinking more of like sometimes called narrative theology by like N.T. Wright, I think refers to it as narrative theology as opposed to biblical theology. But how does this fit into the grand narrative of Scripture?
Yeah, good. Thanks for pressing on that question because that's an important question. And it's really important, I think, for us as pastors to think through as well as church members to think through. So much of the way the church has talked the last 50 years in my experience, again, limited experience, my experience has started post-Genesis 3 rather than pre-Genesis 3. And so when we talk about spiritual growth, what we're talking about is helping people become human again. That the more holy you are, the more human you are. So when God first made the world, Genesis 1 and 2, God deemed humans as good. And they were the kind of the culminating moment in his creative process. And humans were good, and they were put in the garden with a specific objective to live in partnership with God. And in that partnership with God, extend his purposes and his agendas into this world as sort of like small little kings and queens under the high king of heaven authority, extending his project and his purposes into the world. So that's what we were created to be and created to do. Then you get to Genesis 3, where we decided we're going to go our own way, forget the high king of heaven, we'll just do it ourselves. That's where the project got off track. That's where we went awry. And that's where thus not only nature got messed up, but our human nature got messed up as well with the fall in Genesis 3. And so the grand narrative of Scripture is the story of how God intends, if you will, to make humans good again. And calls Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, right? Calls Abraham, and through Abraham, he says that he's going to bless all the nations of the earth. So he's going to reverse the curse and bring his blessing back to the world through Abraham and his seed. The initial fulfillment, obviously, is the nation of Israel, who recapitulates the sin of Adam and Eve by breaking faith with their creator, not being faithful to the covenant, and thus they experience their own version of the curse and are exiled from their land. God brings them back to their land, at least in part. And then we get the ultimate seed of Abraham in the person of Jesus himself, who is not only God in the flesh, but the model human by which we now have a template for what it looks like to be genuinely human again. So the process of spiritual growth is ultimately becoming like Jesus, because when we become like Jesus, we're becoming who God originally made us to be. And now we can extend his purposes and his agendas back into the world again. So that's the sweep of Scripture in a nutshell, and how spiritual growth fits into that. So individually, I'm not just becoming by my own spiritual growth is not just my personal thing. It's part of the human thing. We are becoming more human, the more like Christ we become.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I mean, do you think that there's, I've thought about this with biblical theology, is that sometimes it's talked about, we talk about creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And sometimes people have suggested, well, maybe we should actually think beyond just restoration of what was lost in Eden pre-fall, as we should think of it as, sometimes it's used different terms, right? Like fulfillment or something like that. In other words, what we see at the end of the book of Revelation is not just that we've come full circle and we've been returned to Eden, but that what we've come to is now something different. It's the fulfillment.
Something bigger and greater almost. It's like Garden of Eden on steroids. You know? It's like it's bigger and greater. And so this process of redemption doesn't just take us back to Eden. It takes us forward so that what was supposed to grow out of Eden now is already there in some form, it seems, in the new earth, and that there'll be this partnership between humans and God again, but we're not starting at the beginning. We're starting somewhere further down the line in the project, that there's some sort of fulfillment, some sort of, it's a garden city there in Revelation 21 and 22, not just a garden.
And so how does that apply then to what God's doing with us through spiritual growth? You said bringing us back to what was lost, making us more human, but is there a way that we go then beyond just what was lost?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, yes. In some sense, we go beyond what was lost. I'm not sure I have a real clear handle on what that would be. And I think that may be, I haven't thought enough about it. It also may be that the pictures of what's to come in Scripture are incomplete, partial, and vague enough that I don't think we can fully conceptualize what it will be. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We know it'll be Eden-like, but it'll be more than that. We know it'll be a reunion with our Maker in a sense that goes beyond the current reunion we have right now. We know it'll be a reunion with loved ones, right? And we will all be together with the Lord forever. We know all that. It's just hard to picture exactly what that looks like. And I guess I've accepted the fact that the Lord has seen fit not to fill us in on the details, probably because we couldn't fully grasp them all because they're so beyond our wildest imagination.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think? Do you have thoughts on what that beyond might be?
Well, I can think about the physical aspects of it, right? Like I think that the resurrection bodies we will receive are more than just perhaps what Adam had in the garden.
Yeah, definitely. That seems to be the case.
Yeah. But then like the spiritual growth, like is there a way, maybe, I mean, you could say that what we have in the eschaton, right, is actually like the marriage supper of the Lamb, which seems to be even something greater than what Adam experienced in walking with and knowing God.
Yeah.
And Adam needed a companion. Remember, it was not good that he should be alone, but Jesus says that in the kingdom of heaven, people will not be given in marriage because they will be essentially wedded to the Lord. And so anyway, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, that in some sense. No, I think so. I also think that one of the other differences will be in however the Lord pulls it off, we will have seemed to have been confirmed in our capacity for faithfulness, and thus the option of unfaithfulness doesn't seem to be there, and right, like there's not going to be sin anymore, right? And so there won't be a tree of knowledge of good and evil in the new heavens and the new earth by which we could choose, because we don't need to make that choice anymore, because our enduring faithfulness to the end will have confirmed us in our faithfulness forever in some way. I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know how that plays out.
Dang, we should write a book. All right. You just wrote a book, John. Could you share about that for a moment?
Yeah, me and a friend of mine wrote a book aimed at helping Christians do a better job in 2024 election year in the United States than we did in 2020. So It's called Following Jesus in a Politically Divided World. And so it's trying to provide a little bit of a biblical and theological framework for how to think about what it means to be the church and Christians in relationship to a country or society, that we are citizens first and foremost of heaven, and thus outposts of heaven in whichever city or country or community we live in. And then as such, how can we think intentionally, Christianly, and biblically about the issues that are plaguing whatever country we're living in? And so it's really guided to be created to be interactive and help us think like a disciple of Jesus with regard to our own country, the hot button issues in our country, and some of that. So following Jesus in a politically divided world, that's what it's called.
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to check it out.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to spiritual growth. Here's question number 2. What is the role of grace in spiritual growth?
Yeah. And I just think that's so important because, we're not just like saved to get our ticket to heaven, and that's what happens by grace, right? Like grace intends to be the engine that drives spiritual growth and the environment in which spiritual growth happens. And so everything about our own spiritual growth and our becoming like Jesus and our putting off of the vices that ruin our humanness and putting on the virtues that embody our humanness, right? All of that is supposed to be enabled and empowered by the grace of God. And so having a big, huge view of grace is critical. So whenever I talk about discipleship, spiritual formation, spiritual growth, whatever phrase you want to use, whenever I talk about that, I always try to emphasize, that the 2 big truths about grace that show up in the New Testament with regard to conversion. First truth is often associated with the doctrine of justification, right? That we are justified, that is declared right. We're put into a right relationship with God by means of our faith in Jesus. And so that we have this now that regardless of where we're at, we're 100% forgiven and we're in a perfectly right relationship with God. So I usually summarize that truth as grace makes it safe to be a work in progress. Sometimes I've said it as dramatically as grace makes it safe to be a sinner, but people have taken that the wrong way.
Yeah.
They've taken that to mean that it's safe for me just to keep on sinning. That's not what I'm saying. It's saying it's safe for me to come to God as I am, warts and all, sins and all, be completely honest and transparent, confess my sins, and God's going to welcome me and not reject me. And even once I'm part of his family, he's not going to reject me in spite of the fact I continue to sin, and I'm still trying to learn to be like Jesus. So it's safe to be a work in progress.
John, I have a clarifying question. Are you saying that we should sin so that grace may abound?
And Paul would say, me genoita, may it never be. Yeah. But that's the right question to ask. And when Paul preached the doctrine of grace in Romans 3, 4, 5, and 6, and he anticipated that very question because he preached this first truth so strongly. Grace makes it safe to be less than perfect, to be a work in progress, that we can be justified by virtue of God's grace through the redemption that's in Christ Jesus, Romans 3, 24 and following. And so it's safe for us to be not perfect. It's safe for us to be, okay, I'm trying to figure this out. I'm stumbling my way forward, right? So that's the first great truth about grace, that we're justified. We're put in this right relationship with God. And that, I think when it comes to spiritual growth, one of the obvious implications of that is it makes it safe for me to own my junk, to confess my sins. And you can't change if you can't admit your mistakes. You can't change if you can't receive feedback. But if I'm completely loved and fully welcomed by my Creator, who knows everything about me, right? Like if my house is full of hidden cameras and all of a sudden I discover that, now I know, crud, someone knows all the secrets of my life, right? And then that person turns out to be my Creator, and he loves me anyhow and welcomes me into his family anyhow and calls me his son anyhow. And that, okay, no one else could find out anything about me that he doesn't already know. And he already proved how much he loves me. He literally loved me to death in the person of Jesus. There's a lot of security and safety in that. So now it's safe for me just to confess my mistakes and take the honest feedback. And that's going to actually lead to more change than anything else. So first great truth about grace that I think is so important. The second one, follows right after the question you asked. So should we continue in sin that grace may abound? Paul says, may it never be. Me genoita in Greek, no way. God forbid, depending on your translation. And then he goes off. This is Romans chapter 6. And what he tells us is that grace doesn't only make it safe to be a work in progress, grace makes it possible to be transformed. And what he explains in Romans 6 is that we've been set free from sin as our master. He uses that imagery multiple times in Romans chapter 6 and says that, you're slaves to the one you obey. And grace has actually liberated you from the slave master sin and now given you a new master, righteousness. And now you're actually free to obey righteousness and you don't have to listen to sin anymore. And all of it, like if you got a new job, right, you're not going to call your old boss before you go to work in the morning and say, anything you need me to do before I go to my new job. He's not your boss anymore. And grace has set us free from sin being our boss. And that's really important. But one of the things that's often missed in Romans 6, right around verse 5 and 6, Paul also says that knowing this, so he just assumes, he didn't start the Roman church, but he assumes they know this because it was apparently just stock part of early Christian evangelism and teaching. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified, that our body of sin should be null and void, that we should no longer be slaves to sin. That statement is incredibly profound when we understand what Paul just said, that in our coming to Christ, somehow grace made it so that our old in Adam identity was crucified, not should be crucified, but it actually was, so that this body that was dominated and controlled by sin no longer is in charge, with the result that we should no longer be slaves to sin. So that's powerful, and grace makes it possible now to actually live the kind of human life we were created to live because we've been set free from the power of sin, not just the penalty of sin.
Yeah, that's really good. So grace isn't just the way that we're justified, it's also the means by which we're sanctified.
Yes.
And have you ever tried to take a stab at defining the word grace? I try to do it all the time, actually.
Well, obviously there's the standard, unmerited favor, right? I've heard a little acrostic or acronym for it, God's riches at Christ's expense, but that only gets at part of it, but it gets at some of it, and so what grace seems to be, someone else once described grace as love that stoops. These are descriptions of part of it.
Yeah.
Grace seems to be an expression of God's love that grants his help and his gifts to people who were not capable of helping themselves. I don't know if that's totally accurate, but that would be kind of a descriptive summary of some of those.
Yeah, I think the difficulty with it is that grace has many aspects, right? It has multiple aspects. And so you don't want to be too reductionistic. What I found, I like to, I think a part of teaching is defining things. And so I've given several definitions of faith and I've given, try to come up with my own kind of definitions of grace. Of course, sometimes using those ones that you just mentioned, but the one that I was mentioning to my church recently was that grace is, in essence, it's God's provision to meet your need, whatever that need might be. But I think that your definition covered that and maybe it was better than mine. So
I don't know. Yours is nice and short and succinct, and that's always sticky and helpful to people.
Okay, so my next question for you, how can a church be structured in order to facilitate spiritual growth? And I say this as a church that's really striving to do this. In fact, our mission statement for our church is to facilitate gospel transformation through teaching the word of God, engaging in the mission of God, and raising up leaders. And so that idea of facilitating spiritual growth, how do you think a church can best be structured to do that?
Yeah. We should probably just kind of brainstorm together on this because you have a lot of pastoral practical experience and you might have learned some things from it too. But I guess one of my concerns is that it seems like again, for the last 40 or 50 years or so in the evangelical church, at least, the churches, you and I tend to be familiar with, we've put all our eggs in the basket of the Sunday morning service almost, right? Like, we get people to church on Sunday. Maybe they go to a, adult Sunday school type class, maybe not. But if they can come to church and we give them some good worship and sing some good songs and we preach some really great sermons, that's going to do it. I mean, whether we theoretically believe that or not, practically we operate that way in our churches. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Where does, how it is as a pastor, the bulk of our time and energy during the week goes towards debriefing last week's service and planning next week's service, writing next week's sermon, having a staff meeting about what's coming up in the next week's service. And so our budgeting, both of time and money, goes towards hiring staff to make sure we put on good weekend events, which practically says we think that's the way to help people become like Jesus.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Would you agree with that assessment? Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I've seen that for sure. And, I was just telling you before we started recording that I'm doing a class on church structure for a Bible college in Ukraine. And one of the things that I'm talking about is actually how that happens in our movement. And people think, well, what do I need a structure for? What do I need a discipleship pathway for? Because listen, if people just come on Sunday mornings, they're going to get everything that they need. I think there's a lot of problems with that. I think that they're failing to see that there are things that those people need in order to grow, which Sunday morning is a part of, but it's not the only part.
Yes.
And so, we need to have more of a holistic view of discipleship. Here's the other thing that I often tell this story. Somebody came to me one time, and it was my wife, and she knows this because I've told this story many times. Okay, so she said to me, kind of in passing, she just said, our church, we don't really do discipleship. And then she went on to make her point. It wasn't her point. It was just an aside.
Yeah.
And I was just so bothered by that. And I realized two things. One was, maybe it's just one thing. The thing I realized was that we had failed to communicate what we were doing and why we were doing it and what we hoped that people would get out of their experience with our church. Because in my mind, everything that we did was about spiritual growth and discipleship. And I think that many people, when they think about discipleship, they might have a specific mode or method of discipleship that they have in mind. And so that's what they assume that discipleship is. Discipleship is meeting one-on-one with somebody in a coffee shop and going through a book that asks you certain questions and has you read certain verses. And when you've completed that book, you've been discipled, and now you need to go meet with somebody else.
Right.
Now that's certainly a method of discipleship. I don't necessarily think it's scalable. And I'm not sure that it's even holistic in itself, because I think it's leaving out a lot of things that I think are part of spiritual growth and needed for it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I think you're right on that people have a particular picture in their mind. So when you start talking about discipleship, people have a picture of what they think it should be. And if you're not doing that, you're not doing discipleship. And that's why, I do think that's, there's some unlearning that has to be done in order for accurate learning to be achieved. I do think that's important. I don't think most people have a clear definition. If we were going to talk about a definition of grace, well, most people have a clear definition of a disciple.
Mm-hmm.
What is a disciple? And so I think we're going to have to, if we're going to structure church in a way that's going to create a culture of disciple making and discipleship, a clear definition is going to be really important, right? My definition that I use all the time, it's not the only one. It's just one that I think works and it's accurate biblically. And is that a disciple is someone who arranges their life to be with Jesus in order to become like Jesus.
That's
and
good.
That grows out of, places like Luke 6:42, where Jesus says what he says, that a disciple is not above their master, but every disciple is fully trained becomes like their master. He's just assuming the discipleship world of their day, that a mathetes, a disciple, was somebody who left life as normal behind to be with a rabbi. And the goal was not to know what the rabbi knew, but the goal was to become what the rabbi was. That was the way education worked in Jesus' day. And so if you were a Talmud in Hebrew or a mathetes, disciple of Greek, that's what you did. So that's what Jesus is assuming. So when he says go and make disciples, that's what he's assuming, that model, that you're going to help people rearrange their life to be with Jesus with the express goal of becoming like him, specifically like him in character and in mission. That the character of your life will substantially be like Jesus's, and the mission of your life will also become substantially like Jesus's mission. So having that one sentence definition, you can say that over and over and over again in a church, which begins to help people hear what they're supposed to be. That alone is powerful. I just had a 20-something teaching my class at Boise Bible College this semester. She's been Christian for a while. She's in her upper 20s, going to a church here in town, a church that the pastor there and I put together the discipleship process they're using. And she said, I've gone to church a long time, and now that I've been going to this church the last couple of years, it's the first time I realized, I'm supposed to become like Jesus. As pastors, we kind of assume people would just automatically know that.
Yeah.
But they don't, right? And so, are you a disciple of Jesus? That means you're arranging your life to be with Jesus, to become like him. You say that in every platform, in every venue, a lot of events. Now you're creating a culture where that's the norm, that's the assumption. That alone is powerful. Just having a clear definition, I think, is really helpful. But then you got to think through, okay, so are we doing that? Are the activities that we're, in our church body, are they facilitating people are they helping people learn how to be with Jesus and facilitating being with Jesus so that they are learning how to become like Jesus? How do we do that? And I think there needs to be a lot of just kind of practical ecclesiological thinking along those terms of how do we do that? And if we have an activity that isn't fostering that, can the activity be tweaked so that we can do the same thing differently to achieve that? Or does the activity need to be scrapped because it's just in the way at this point, And I think that's really important. I also think one of the things we see in the New Testament is that discipleship always happens through a life-on-life transfer. Always. The disciples with Jesus, they're learning from him, right? And then the disciples themselves are supposed to go make disciples of Jesus, but they're offering themselves as a pattern. And so you get repeatedly in Paul's writings where he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ, or Philippians chapter 4, verse 9, the things you've seen and heard in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you, right? He's calling people to look at his pattern for how he's following Jesus as an example for other people to follow. And so it always happens that way. People need concrete patterns of what Christ-likeness look like. So do we have things within our church systems and structures that facilitate that help people have concrete examples, right? I mean, I think we have to think that through. I was also thinking, the Expositors Collective, that's how we got connected. We do these training events. That's where we were at, where this conversation started. Well, think about how we help people grow in their private study, and public proclamation of God's word, right? Like, how do we do that? Well, we don't just stand up front and speak to them. There's some of that, but then we also break them into groups, and we practice a little bit, and, they actually deliver a short message, and we give feedback, right? It's more of a coaching model. I coached soccer for 9 years, right? It's more of a coaching model where you drill and practice, and you give feedback, and you help people change. When do we ever do that in the church? So thinking through some of those things is like, how could we create environments and systems where people could begin to actually live out the Sermon on the Mount, where the expectation was they would, and we would actually help them do that. Go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all I commanded you. Not teaching them to know, but to obey. Where do we do that, right? Like, where does that coaching happen? Where it's like, the way you're currently talking to your son and your daughter, I've listened to you do that. That doesn't seem to embody the kindness and the wisdom of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Can I help you figure out how to do that a little bit better? Do we have that assumption? And would people be open to that? I mean, I don't know that we've created that environment where that's what's expected and that's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, just thinking about like andragogy, I heard somebody teaching on this a while back, and oddly enough, when I was in Hungary pastoring that church, a couple of the people in my church were, andragogy majors. So andragogy is kind of the opposite of pedagogy. Pedagogy is about how do you teach children effectively. Andragogy is how do you teach adults effectively.
Yeah.
And the thing about andragogy that I learned through these folks at my church was that adults learn best by doing things. So for example, I watch a lot of basketball. And I understand in theory, like what it takes to play basketball well, but I probably wouldn't actually be able to do it because I haven't actually done it. So I think that doing things is a critical way in which adults learn, which is why, as you're mentioning with Expositors Collective, part of it is that it's not just lectures about how to preach good and do other stuff good too. It's actually like, okay, now you're going to try it. And then, And so, I'm feeling pretty good right now, John, about my discipleship pathway that I created because, I think that was our goal in doing it.
Okay.
And, it's like, how do we get people to actually do things that are going to help them to grow? So, shall we do it? Shall we have you?
Yeah. So
okay. I texted you our discipleship pathway infographic, and in the show notes, let's put a link to where people can view it for themselves.
Okay.
But I'm also going to just kind of describe it for people. That's the difficulty of audio.
Don't get to see it here.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So here it's like a gray background, and it has on the top level, it has this kind of like progressive arrow system, and it has 4 headings under that. One is connect, next is grow, then is serve, and then is multiply. And so the idea is that you're moving from connecting to multiplying. And then on the bottom, there's a subsection that says spiritual disciplines. And we listed 8 spiritual disciplines. There are more, but these are the 8 that we mentioned. And the idea with this, if we were to like present it to somebody, which we do actually all the time, is that we would say the goal of the top section is to give you opportunities to practice the spiritual disciplines, which we believe will help you to grow. And so these are different ways that we facilitate you putting these things into practice that exist in our church. And what we would say is that every single thing we do in our church has been strategically designed to help you to grow into a disciple of Jesus. So the first section is connect. So we consider this like person walks in the door. Here are the things that we believe that they need to do in order to start out. Attend worship services. We actually believe that is foundational. It's not secondary to us. We believe that being in the worshiping environment, worshiping God, hearing his word proclaimed, and taking communion, which we do every Sunday at our church, we believe that is foundational. Next is we say, we also think you need, if you're getting connected to Jesus Christ, you need to be baptized.
Yeah.
And once you've believed, and then we would say, okay, then that what it says next steps, that's a class that we do at our church. Next steps class, which essentially introduces you to our church, our values, and ways that you can take your next step with us. Usually we try to, our goal with that class is to answer any questions that somebody has and then connect them to a community group or a service team. And the reason is because we believe that in order for people to grow as disciples, they need to be practicing spiritual disciplines in community. They need to be reading scripture. They need to be praying together. And those are the 2 main things that happen at those gatherings, and fellowship.
Yeah.
And we also believe, though, that serving is a necessity for being a disciple of Jesus, because Jesus identified himself as the greatest servant. He's called the servant of the Lord in the Old Testament. And so to be like him means to serve with the same heart and motivation that he had. So we have a mantra: join a group, join a team. That's what we want everyone in our church to do.
Gotcha.
So next level is grow. So this is for the person who's connected. What do I do next? How do I grow? We have a foundations class that's kind of like foundational theology. And, who is God? Who is man? It's actually drawn from the Heidelberg Catechism, not directly, but the big questions that we ask and answer are drawn from the Heidelberg Catechism.
Gotcha.
And then community groups, that's kind of our main vehicle. I always tell people this is our main vehicle for spiritual disciplines in the church. These are where you meet with other people and you practice spiritual disciplines, reading scripture, praying together, fellowshipping together, serving together, resting together, perhaps even fasting together, right? And and then Bible studies, that means like men's and women's Bible studies. And then Bible Learning Center, which is our classroom style, kind of like Bible college light types of classroom style adult education. Okay, next level, serving. We have ministry teams, we have outreach events, and we have mission teams. And then the final level is multiply. This is at the point where you are now ready to begin leading other people. And so we'd say you can serve as a ministry leader. Cultivate is our church planter training program. If God's calling you to plant a church, we would want you to get involved in Cultivate. And then mentoring. So we do one-on-one mentoring. We make that available. So the mentoring one could be moved to another area perhaps. Yeah. But so that's the big picture. Now, John, go ahead.
I can see why you're feeling pretty good about it. You guys have put a lot of thought into this. It's better than most churches I've seen. So kudos to you, at least from me, for what that's worth.
Thanks. Yeah.
No, there's part of the reason we want to do this is, a lot of churches have what I call more of an organization, kind of involvement or assimilation process than a discipleship process. Right. And you're like, oh no, I wonder if that's what ours is. And it's got some of that. It does have some of that. Because someone, you're going to have someone in your Next Steps class who may have been a believer for 15, 20 years and may have intentionally been following Jesus and are substantially like Jesus, right? They're really, in their own personal growth, they're more down at the multiply stage than down here at the connect stage, right?
Yeah.
But they're still going to go to your Next Steps class, which is beginning, right? So they get to know Whitefields and all that. So there's some sense of, okay, that's kind of an organizational involvement or assimilation, requirement. But you also have some things that are very intentionally more like, how does an individual go from new believer to mature believer? Mm-hmm. And to me, that's what a discipleship pathway, it has to chart that path of how does somebody go from I'm brand new with Jesus to I now am substantially like Jesus so that my life is truly reflecting him in the world. Whatever our discipleship pathway does, it has to chart a path for people. Most churches just don't have that. And yours has some of that. Yours definitely has, so you're pointing people in a direction. So if they are a new believer, where are they supposed to get to? Well, you're supposed to get to the multiply stage, where you're using your life helping other people become believers and growing in Christ too. I'm assuming that's what you communicate in that multiply stage. Yeah. Plus you got the spiritual, the individual spiritual disciplines down here that kind of, are done individually, but they can also be done corporately and collectively as well. So I like a lot of what you've done.
Cool.
Yeah. The one that I've used quite a bit and I've recommended before on my podcast here is just using the language of faith. So pre-faith, new faith, young faith, growing faith, mature faith. So it's just pointing people towards, your goal is to become mature in the faith. So even if you're pre-faith, which you don't really totally have on here, but if you're pre-faith, hopefully there's people coming to Whitefield or whatever church we're in that, okay, I'm curious. They're not opposed to the faith. They're pre-faith. I'm curious. I think I might need God. I'm not sure what this church thing is all about, but I want to go and check it out. And they got questions. So that's a distinct stage, where an individual might be at. all the way down to mature faith, where it's like your life is substantially like Jesus from the inside out.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to chart a course. Well, the first time I ever put that pathway up on the screen to the last place I was pastoring at, I had a guy come up to me between services in the lobby, wait till it kind of cleared out, and say, hey, you know that pathway thing you put up on the screen? I was like, yeah. He said, like, I have been a Christian for like 10 years, and I would put myself still down in like the newer young faith stage. And I was like, well, why is that? He's like, because no one ever told me where I was supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
He was like, so I knew I was supposed to go to church, serve, volunteer in the church, and tithe. That's what I was supposed to do, the big three, right? Attend, the church service, serve in some way, kids ministry, greeting at the door, whatever it is, and make sure I give my 10%. And if I do that, I'm being a good Christian. What you're being is a good church member at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not necessarily becoming like Jesus. And because no one had told him that he was supposed to, that he was supposed to become like Jesus and how to do that. So that's the one thing I would say on yours is it would be worth making sure in how you communicate it, that the goal of all of this is for you to clean the inside of the cup, in Jesus' language, right? The goal for all of this is for you to be full on the inside of the dispositions that we call the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, right? Like when your internal furniture is full of those things, the external actions look a lot like what Jesus would look like if he were in your place.
Yeah.
That's what we're after. So however you communicate that as part of your process, I think that would be important. The one I use has little arrows underneath the little chart that says, be with Jesus, become like Jesus, do what Jesus would do.
Mm-hmm.
And so it points people in that direction, that's where we're at. But
yeah, I can see that the character aspect is, the transformed character aspect isn't really mentioned on mine.
Yeah, even though it's mentioned in your mission statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so whether you put it on the infographic or not, or whether you think about how we communicate that with the infographic, that would help, as well as having a crystal clear one sentence definition of what a disciple is. I think that becomes the peg that hangs us on. So all of this is aimed at helping you do that.
Yeah.
Whether you use the one I gave you, earlier or not, something where it's like that becomes the hook on which these are means to that end. The end is for you to rearrange your life to be with Jesus in order to become like him. We're offering some things to help you do that.
I found that many of the things that I've done in ministry that I'm really glad about were birthed out of frustrations that at first I was frustrated, and then I realized that actually I had failed to do something well. And so I'll give you an example with the discipleship pathway. It's very similar to like the guy you're talking about. I remember having a young believer in our church who was just like so pumped and ready to go. And he's like, man, I want to spend my life like pursuing the Lord. What should I do? And the best answer I had to give to him was, you should like join our setup team, and you should come to church on Sunday and maybe join the men's group. And then I realized, man, that is so, I don't know, like I'm not helping this person, because he needs to know, what do I do next? How do I know if I'm moving in the right direction? What's the destination that I should be aiming towards? What am I working up to? And, and so that led to me thinking along discipleship pathways. And then when my wife made this statement about that we're not a church that does discipleship, that was also, again, frustrating. But then it made me realize that, okay, no. I have failed to communicate why we do the things that we do.
Yeah.
And and I could go with Expositors Collective. Here's a quick story, and it's a bit of an aside, but it goes into what we're talking about here. I had this guy who was in our church, and he had a degree from a well-known evangelical seminary. And so I was going out of town one weekend, and I said, hey, you should preach this Sunday, or maybe it was a few weeks out. But he said to me, I'm not a very good preacher. And I said, never mind. I thought it was like kind of false humility. Turns out he was not being humble. That was just a matter of fact. He was not a good preacher, and he preached I mean, it's like one of those messages that you have to like take off the internet to make sure that no one ever listens to it. And I remember we had a much smaller staff at the time, and I told our administrator, I said, I am never going to let that guy preach again. And my administrator wisely said back to me, well, did you train him? Did you teach him? Did you tell him what you expected? Did you help him succeed? Yeah. And I said, well, no. And he said, well, then how'd you expect him to succeed? And I was like, dagger to the heart, 100% correct. And then I realized that I need to be actually like training people to do things. And you know, a lot of really good things happen in a church once you start training people to do things. Yeah. It changes the church.
It's one of the core values that has to undergird our whole forming a culture of discipleship. We have to go from just a teaching mentality to a training mentality where what we're really trying to do is form people. And so how do we create that training mentality, that training environment for all, you know, and not just for the way we want it done in our organization, but training in the sense that we're actually forming people, character and mission-wise, whose heart is like Jesus's, who beats in rhythm with Jesus. If we begin to think in terms of from exclusively telling to training and forming, that begins to shape things, you know. And so I do think that's really critical. And so I think your pathway's got, you know, super solid. The character side I think is important. One of the things I think is important to help people identify where they're at, and that's one of the things maybe why I like mine maybe over yours a little bit. You know, it puts it in the model of a kind of a growth pattern that you go from pre-faith to new faith. What does someone who's new in the faith need? Well, as I tried to identify the top 2 or 3 needs, one of them is they need to be reading their Bible and praying, and they need to be doing it in relation with someone who's further down the path. You get a new believer reading their Bible and praying in relationship with somebody who's a little further down the path, they'll both grow, right? You know, or what does a mature believer need? Well, a mature believer actually, one of the things he needs is relationships with people who are in the new and young faith stage, because they ask questions that force him to learn and grow. They remind him of things that he forgot about when he was a new believer, and some of the energy of that. It'll energize them and help them now learn new things, because this guy's asking questions he's never thought about because he's a new believer at this stage in history, and he has questions that this guy never asked. And now he's got to learn, and everyone grows, right? So it helps people realize. And then you can also begin to think through, how do we move someone from through each stage? Like organizationally, what do we offer resources and opportunities wise? It'll help someone go from new believer to young believer to growing believer. So what's needed at each sort of growth stage? So that sort of, you know, it's sort of almost like that parenting model where, you know, your toddlers need something different than your elementary schoolers to your preteens and early teens to your later teens. They're all at different stages, right? And they have different needs. And so figuring out some of that, you know, with an individual, I think is helpful too. And how do you address those various needs, all towards the end of helping them become like Jesus? But
yeah, that's good, John. I think we solved it.
I don't know if we solved it, but we just killed 56 minutes talking about it. So,
well, I think it was good. It was helpful. So
yeah.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up. John, where can people follow up with you online or connect with your stuff?
Yeah. 2 websites, johnwicker.net. That's got my Bible and Life podcast, as well as some online courses and other resources there. Or listenerscommentary.com, which is where they can find the listener's commentary. They can listen to it there, but they can also then subscribe on YouTube or download the app or something like that. So listenerscommentary.com. Those are the easiest places to find me. What about you?
Yeah, you can. I have a website, nickcady.org. So that's nickcady.org. I wrote a book a while back. You can find that on there. I've got my podcast on there, as well as articles that I've written. I used to do a call-in radio show for like 7 years, and I took some of the questions that I had received from there and I started answering them in article format. And so there's tons of articles on the website, just kind of responding to questions and dealing with things like that. So yeah, feel free to check that out. And you can also check out my church's website at whitefieldschurch.com.
All right. Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, John.